I'll share a little bit about my own connection to Butler a little later. But this meeting came about in a very organic fashion. Two friends from Emory, who are actually on the way coming down here, and I decided that we wanted to come by Butler Island today on the 14th of July to just look around. They'd heard me talk about my research, and I'm always coming down here, so I want to come with you. I then called Tiffany. Tiffany, can you raise your hand real quickly? And she'll tell you about herself a little later, but she's a Butler descendant. And I got in contact with Tiffany through another lady called Annette. Annette Holmes is based out of California, and you'll see her name among the participants there. Brief introduction. What happened was, my research has been about Butler since about, actually a long time ago, since about 1997, when I was driving on Coastal Highway 17, right up the street, and I happened to see that brick chimney. I'm a landscape architect, and so the structure just caught my attention because it looked like a brick structure just rising out of the marsh grass. So I said, well, let me stop, take a look. I stopped, took a few pictures, went on my way. I was then at the University of Georgia. I was doing research on tabby, which Robert mentioned, and tabby brought me down to this area. So when I saw the chimney, took a picture of it, went back to Athens, Georgia, I decided to expand my research into tabby. To make a long story short, I checked out about 5 books from the University of Georgia Library. All of them had different authors, different titles. They seemingly had no connection. They were from 3 different levels in the library. Imagine my surprise when I found out that 3 of those books talked about this place, the Butler Plantation. In fact, I have the 3 books in my bag right now. One was by a lady called Frances Ann Kemble. Fanny Kemble, most of you have heard about, and we'll talk about her a little later. Fanny Kemble was married to a gentleman called Pierce Mays Butler, who was a grandson of the person who started this plantation. Fanny Kemble was from England, came to this country in 1832, married this guy in 1834. They came down here in 1838 to check out these plantations. She was an abolitionist at heart and hated the institution of slavery. She and her husband fell out over slavery, but she wrote a journal while she was here, and it's called Journal of a Residence on a Georgian Plantation. I'll pass it around for those of you who are not familiar with it. But this book by Fanny Kemble is a very powerful book by a very powerful woman. She stood up against the culture of that time and that day, and she wrote out against slavery. She said she was a woman. She stood up in front of her husband and said, I'm a woman. I don't think it's right for these women to go out into the fields and do this hard labor, sometimes just 3 weeks after childbirth. And she recalled a lot of the horrors. She said, and pardon me, but she says in this book that some of the women would come and see her, and some of the women would lift up their clothes, their dresses. And I beg your pardon, but she said there was stuff hanging out of them. Okay, so, but again, her book is very powerful. I read this book and I was, okay, she has it. I know a lot of you have encountered the book already. Another book I picked up was by Malcolm Bell. Great book, titled Major Butler's Legacy, 5 Generations of a Slaveholding Family. Malcolm Bell, Fanny Kemble. In fact, I have to be quite honest, the next book I picked up was a book titled 10 Years on the Georgia Plantation, written by a woman called Frances Lee. Imagine my surprise when I realized that Frances Lee was the daughter of Fanny Kemble. And I thought, that's odd. Fanny Kemble was against slavery. Her daughter Francis Lee was a supporter of slavery. He's passing around too. The third book was this book by Malcolm Bell. And in this book, I found a picture of this chimney that I had just passed. So I thought, wow, what a coincidence. Well, that, needless to say, ladies and gentlemen, got my attention big time. And so I started researching the Butler family. There's a lot to be told about the Butlers. Some of you have heard about the slave sale in 1859 called the Weeping Time. The Weeping Time. I said I'm not going to preach or teach, so I have to wind down. But the Weeping Time was this slave sale in 1859 in Savannah, Georgia. Reverend Lawson here, Reverend Lawson, please raise your hand, has written a book on the Weeping Time. It's called The Weeping Time by Gullah Geechee. I think the title is correct, pardon me. But 460 people from Butler plantations. Butler owned this one in Hampton, which is on St. Simon's Island. He advertised 460 slaves to be sold. Ultimately, 429 were sold in 2 days in Savannah, Georgia. And it's called The Weeping Time. I had read about that. My wife is from Savannah. I thought, wow, I go to Savannah. I've never heard about this. I said I'll make it short, so let me wrap up. But I was invited to give a talk in Savannah last year, March 6th, on the Weeping Time, because I've been researching it. And in anticipation of what some of the questions from the audience would be, I thought, well, where did the enslaved people end up? Those who were sold in Savannah, where did they go? So I started research on the internet. And I found a reference that led me to a woman in California called Annette Holmes. She's a descendant, and Annette will have to tell you her story. We had tried to get her here, but she couldn't come. Annette was born and raised in Oakland, California area, has never been to Georgia, never been to Texas, never been to Louisiana. Traced herself and her lineage to that slave sale in Savannah in 1859, which I think is fantastic. So we're trying to get Annette here one of these days. Anyway, once I got in touch with her over the phone, kept telling her, this is huge, you should come down, I'd love to drive you to Butler Island and Darien and meet all the people. But she put me in touch with Tiffany. She said, well, I can't be there, but I know another descendant who's right in Atlanta. So she gave me Tiffany's number, and we've been communicating ever since. All three of us, Annette, Tiffany, and I, will get on the conference call and talk. Now, so that's how this meeting came about. Two friends from Georgia, from Emory, and I were planning to come here. Turns out Annette and her family were planning to come here this very weekend. Sorry, Tiffany. Tiffany and her family were planning to come here this very weekend. So I thought, what an interesting coincidence. And I said, then why don't we do this? Since you are a descendant and a researcher, it would have more gravitas if you were here. So we got on the phone, tried to see if Annette could come, if we could get her from California. But I think she loves California so much. But she's coming. And in fact, she has sent us a video at some point. Hopefully we can share it, maybe. But that's why we're here. It became very organic. One person told another, and all of a sudden, you know, we're here. So I want to thank all of you. I want to recognize some people real quickly. We talked about Reverend Lawson, Councilwoman Eunice Moore. Please raise your hand. Right there in Darien.
I'm on grassroots.
Yes, grassroots. Of course, Miss Alberta Mabry. Please raise your hand again. Who led us in the libation. Thank you. Also, Dr. Collins, will you please raise your hand? Dr. William Collins, he is retired here from the medical profession, but he's an avid genealogist and has been trying to help connect people in the Darien area with their ancestors. Who else? Of course, Miss Jeannie Sirac. Please raise your hand. Some of you already know Jean. I met her years ago. She is, and I think I have to read it because her title is so special and long, I don't want to mess it up. This Jeannie is African American Programs Coordinator for the Historic Preservation Division of none other than Georgia DNR, Department of Natural Resources. She is in charge of the entire state of Georgia, and in terms of the African American historic structures and landscapes. So we're honored, Jeannie, that you made time in your business schedule to be here. She's also the editor of Reflections, which is it's online magazine. She goes around the state. She meets with lots of folks, and lots of buildings that are endangered, either done by African American architects or something to do with African American culture. She's the curator of all that, so we're pleased to have her here. Of course, my wife Latrice is here with me. She's been supporting with me all these years and hears about Butler all the time. I have to recognize also, where is Miss Gloria Cates? Please raise your hand. Gloria is also here. She flew in from New Jersey. This is how this thing grew. When Tiffany mentioned to her, she said, "I'm dropping everything, I'm coming." So at one point I thought, what's going to happen in Butler? People are planning to come, and I'm not even sure what we're going to do. A good friend of mine, Mashadi, please raise your hand. She's from Emory, my cohort at Emory, and her mother, Dr. Paula. They do research similarly. And Mashadi, I was at the computer a couple of days ago. Mashadi came and says, "Are you working on your dissertation?" And I wasn't. But before I could say anything, she saw the program on the screen and says, "Wow, what's this? This is powerful. My mom's in town, we're coming." I tried to persuade her to not come. They got here before I got here. All right, so now having said that, we made time. We said we're going to spend between 9 and 11 o'clock this morning talking about this very connection. So, I have shared a little bit of how I got involved with this. Tiffany is going to go next and share. We'd like anybody who is here who knows they're a Butler descendant or a King descendant for that matter. Another point, the Butlers who started the plantation had very important managers. Some of you have heard Roswell King's name. Tiffany, I believe, is a descendant of King, and she'll talk about that. Roswell King was the manager or the overseer of the 2 Butler plantations. Now, some of you may also have heard of Roswell, Georgia, or the same Roswell King who managed this plantation from 1802 to 1818, left here and went and started the town of Roswell, Georgia. His son, Roswell King Jr., in turn managed this plantation from 1818 well into the 1830s. So, with that, I will sit down and Tiffany will share hers. And then Miss Gloria is here. Would like you to share. Reverend Lawson, everybody who's on that in terms of participants, take a few minutes to whatever time you want. Just share with us about your connection. And anybody else, open to everybody else. Yes.
Well, like he said, I'm Tiffany Young, and just about 8 years into our family's genealogical research now. But it all started for me with stories from my grandfather. And he used to just be so mysterious and so superstitious and hanging, what do you call it, horseshoes over the door and just all kind of different little things that he used to tell me about his wife having a root on her and scorpions running out of her side. And I'm like, well, where'd I do that at? Where is it going on at? And he's like, they're all dead now. I'm like, no, something else got to be alive. So let me find out where it is. So that, those types of things is what was my driving, force, I guess, to keep me, motivated and find out what was behind these mysteries, these black people. We're from over home, just us. So I'm like, where is that? Let me find that too. So I found Butler by way of Buddy Sullivan because the last census that I found was on Broughton Island, which I think is across the street. Broughton Island.
Look at that map.
It's on the map. They're going to show it to us on the map. But it's not far. So they homestead almost across the street on another island. And then I had to call this guy named Buddy Sullivan that wrote a book about the history here in McIntosh. And he told me where Broughton was and that I was probably a king from Butler and I needed to come down here. And so I did. Yes, Mr.
Quick question, sorry to interrupt you. How did you get started on King or Broughton to start with?
King or Broughton, because my grandfather told me his last known descendant was Bristol King, his grandfather. And then I found like